October 8th, 2005. A concrete room under a stadium in Sudan. 22 footballers who should be screaming. Instead, someone walks a live television camera in and hands a microphone to a Chelsea striker still soaked in his kit. And he drops to his knees on the floor and begs his own country to stop killing itself. Days later, the guns went quiet. That's the story you've heard. It's wrong, and what actually happened is stranger and much harder to dismiss. Here's the version that made it onto every highlight reel and into every list of the greatest moments in football history. Didier Drogba stopped a civil war. He asked and armed men put down their weapons, and a nation that had been tearing itself apart for 3 years simply stopped. It's a beautiful story. It's also the kind of story that falls apart the moment you check a single date. The Ivorian Civil War did not end in October 2005. It ended, officially on paper with signatures, in March 2007 in a room in Burkina Faso, negotiated by politicians. And then it started again in 2010 and killed 3,000 more people. So, if the miracle didn't happen, why does this moment still matter more than almost anything else that has ever been said into a football microphone? Because Drogba and that team did something no Ivorian government had managed in a decade, and it wasn't ending the fighting. Stay with me, because the real thing they did is the reason this channel exists. Start with how absurd it is that the moment happened at all. That afternoon in Omdurman, Ivory Coast beat Sudan 3-1, and it meant nothing on its own. Everything depended on a match being played 800 miles away in Yaoundé, where Cameroon needed a win to reach the World Cup. Cameroon were drawing 1-1 deep into stoppage time when they got a penalty. 95th minute, the entire tournament in one kick. Samuel Eto'o didn't want it. The captain, Rigobert Song, didn't want it. A left-back named Pierre Wome picked up the ball, walked to the spot, and hit the outside of the post. That's it. That's the hinge. If Wome's shot moves 4 inches to the right, Cameroon go to Germany, Ivory Coast go home, nobody walks a television camera into a changing room, and one of the most famous speeches in the history of sport is never given. Wome retired from international football a year and a half later. He is remembered in Cameroon for that kick. He is almost never mentioned in the Ivorian story at all, which tells you something about how legends get built. Somebody always has to lose for the miracle to have a stage. Now, the war. And this is the part almost every telling of this story skips, which is a shame, because it's the part that makes the rest make sense. Ivory Coast spent 30 years as the success story of West Africa. Cocoa. The country was, and still is, the largest producer of cocoa on earth, and for decades that money built roads and schools, and a capital city that looked like an argument for the whole continent's future. To grow that much cocoa, you need hands, and the country's founding president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, imported them. Workers came from Burkina Faso, from Mali, from Guinea. They came, they stayed, they had children, and those children had children. Nobody asked too many questions about paperwork because the paperwork wasn't the point. The plantations were. Houphouët-Boigny died in 1993 after 33 years in power. The economy was already sinking. Cocoa prices had collapsed. And the men who wanted his chair discovered a very old political technology. When there isn't enough to go around, you stop arguing about how to divide it and start arguing about who deserves to be in the room. The word they built it on was Ivoirité, Ivorianness. It was coined by Henri Bété, and it sounded at first like a harmless bit of national pride, a shared culture, a shared identity. In practice, it became a test. A real Ivorian was someone born in the country to 2 Ivorian parents. Everyone else, the descendants of the workers who had built the cocoa economy, the Muslim North, the families with a grandmother from Burkina Faso, became something less. Guests, foreigners in the only country they had ever lived in. And then the test got written into law. Ahead of the 2000 elections, a constitutional rule required both parents of a presidential candidate to be born inside Ivory Coast. It excluded exactly one serious politician, Alassane Ouattara, a former prime minister, a former deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and the most popular figure in the north. The country's northern half was told, in the plainest possible legal language, that its leader was not Ivorian enough to be on a ballot. You do not need a degree in political science to see where that goes. There was a coup in 1999. There was a violent election in 2000. And on the 19th of September 2002, several hundred soldiers tried to overthrow the government of Laurent Gbagbo, failed in the south, and succeeded everywhere else. Within days, the country had a line drawn across its middle. Gbagbo's government held Abidjan and the south. A rebel movement calling itself the Forces Nouvelles held the north from the city of Bouaké. French troops and then United Nations peacekeepers sat in the gap between them. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people were killed. More than 1 million were displaced. Here's the thesis this whole video runs on, and it's the reason a football team could touch this war when diplomats couldn't. Most civil wars are about territory or resources or who holds the palace. This one, at its root, was about a definition. It was a war over the question of who counted as Ivorian, and that is a very unusual kind of war because the front line isn't on a map. It runs through a national identity, which means it can be fought, and it can also be contradicted in places that have nothing to do with soldiers. Which brings us to the Ivory Coast national team. Because the national team was the one Ivorian institution that had never once applied the Ivoirité test, and everybody in the country knew it. Look at the squad that qualified in Omdurman. Kolo and Yaya Touré, Muslim, born in Bouaké, the city that was, at that exact moment, the capital of the armed rebellion. Under the logic of the government's own doctrine, they were the wrong sort. In the national shirt, they were the spine of the team. And then there's Drogba himself, who is the sharpest illustration of all. Didier Drogba was born in Abidjan in 1978. At 5 years old, he was put on a plane to France, alone, to live with an uncle who was a professional footballer because his parents thought he'd have a better life there. He grew up French. He was made entirely by French football, Le Mans, Ganjan, Marseille. And he didn't play a competitive match for Ivory Coast until he was 24 years old. He is, ethnically, Bété, from the southwest, the same group as President Gbagbo. And he had spent most of his life somewhere else. So think about what that team physically was. A Bété striker raised in France, 2 Muslim brothers from the rebel capital, players from the north, the south, the center, and the west, almost all of them earning their living in Europe. Under a strict reading of Ivoirité, half of them were exactly the kind of Ivorian the doctrine had learned to be suspicious of. And they were the most loved thing in the country by an enormous margin. That is the whole engine of what happened next. Every peace conference of the previous 3 years had tried to negotiate the definition, to argue, clause by clause, over who belonged. The football team never argued about it. It just stood there, 11 men at a time, being a working counterexample to the idea that had started the war, which is what Drogba understood, and what makes the changing room in Omdurman more than a nice gesture. The team had already talked about it before the tournament. This wasn't improvised. The captain, Cyril Domerode, brought the state broadcaster's camera into the room. Drogba took the microphone, And he did not make a political speech. He didn't take a side. He didn't name the rebels. He didn't name the president. Read what he actually said, and you'll notice it's addressed to a geography. Men and women of Ivory Coast, from the north, the south, the center, and the west. He said they had just proved that all Ivorians could coexist and play together with the same aim. He said the one country in Africa with so many riches must not descend into war. He asked them to lay down their weapons and hold elections. And then the whole squad knelt down on the concrete, arms across each other's shoulders, and Drogba said the word that people in Ivory Coast still quote back to each other 20 years later. Pardonnez, forgive, not agree, not negotiate, forgive. That's a religious verb, not a diplomatic one, and he used it deliberately in a country where the split ran along a Christian south and a Muslim north. He was not asking either side to concede an argument. He was asking them to drop one. Now, the part where the legend breaks, because it has to. The best reporting on this was done by an American journalist named Jordan Ritter-Kahn, who went to Ivory Coast and did the unglamorous thing of asking Ivorians whether the story was true. What he found is that plenty of them think it's been badly oversold. A former Ivorian goalkeeper, Alain Ouattara, gave him a one-word verdict, hypocrisy. His argument was blunt and hard to answer. Maybe for 90 minutes everyone watches the same team. Then the 90 minutes end, and everyone goes back to exactly where they were. And the dates back him up. By late 2005, the war had largely settled into a frozen political stalemate. The heaviest fighting was already behind it. The document that formally ended the first civil war was the Ouagadougou Agreement, signed on the 4th of March, 2007, 17 months after the speech, between Gbagbo and the rebel leader Guillaume Soro, brokered by the president of Burkina Faso, not by a striker, by a mediator in a conference room over months. So, did a footballer end a civil war? No, he didn't. And if that's all you wanted from this story, you can stop here. But if you stop here, you miss the more interesting thing, which is that Drogba's most important act wasn't the speech at all. It came 19 months later, and almost nobody talks about it. In 2007, Ivory Coast had a routine Africa Cup of Nations qualifier against Madagascar. Routine matches are played in the capital. Drogba asked for this one to be moved to Bouaké. Understand what that meant. Bouaké was the rebel headquarters. It was the city the government had been unable to enter for nearly 5 years. The national team had not played there since the war began. Moving the match meant government officials, government security, and 30,000 civilians traveling into territory held by an armed movement to sit in a stadium alongside the fighters who held it and cheer for the same 11 men. They did it. 3rd of June, 2007. Ivory Coast beat Madagascar 5-0. Arona Kone twice, Drogba, Salomon Kalou, Yaya Touré. Troops from both sides watched it together. And later that same summer, in that same stadium in Bouaké, Laurent Gbagbo stood next to Guillaume Soro and set fire to a pile of weapons as a public ceremony marking the end of the war. That sequence is the whole argument of this video. The peace was negotiated by politicians in March. The proof that the peace was survivable happened on a pitch in June. Because here's what every peace deal actually needs, and almost never gets: a public willing to believe that the other half of the country can be stood next to without anyone dying. Diplomats cannot manufacture that. They can only sign documents that assume it. Drogba supplied the demonstration. He put both halves of a split nation in the same stands on the same afternoon in the most contested city in the country and made it look ordinary. That's the pattern this channel keeps returning to. Football doesn't create these conflicts, and it doesn't resolve them, What it does is give a country a room where the argument is temporarily suspended, and occasionally, someone realizes the room can be moved. And then, because this is a true story and not a film, it fell apart. The elections Drogba had asked for finally happened in 2010. Ouattara, the man Ivoirité had been built to exclude, won. Gbagbo refused to accept the results and refused to leave. The country went back to war with itself, and this second round was in some ways worse than the first. Around 3,000 people killed in roughly 5 months, massacres in the west, shelling in Abidjan. It ended in April 2011 with Gbagbo dragged out of a bunker under the presidential residence and eventually flown to The Hague to face the International Criminal Court. Every single thing Drogba had knelt on a concrete floor to prevent happened anyway. 5 years later, over the exact question he'd asked them to settle at the ballot box, he didn't walk away from it. In September 2011, Ouattara set up a commission for dialogue, truth, and reconciliation, and Drogba was named one of its 11 members. A serving Chelsea striker, 33 years old, sitting on his country's Truth Commission while still playing in the Champions League. Within a year, the BBC was reporting that the commission wasn't really working. It ran until 2014, and its results are generously disputed. So, what do you do with a man whose greatest achievement is a war he didn't stop? Here's my honest answer. And then, one last detail that reframes everything. In 2022, Didier Drogba ran to become president of the Ivorian Football Federation. Not the country, just the Football Association. He had global fame, a hospital in Abidjan he'd paid for with his own endorsement money, a United Nations ambassadorship, and the single most beloved public moment in the nation's modern history. He got 21 votes out of 130. The football establishment of the country he is supposed to have saved comfortably declined to give him a desk job, which is, I think, the most clarifying fact in this entire story. Because it proves the thing Drogba had was never institutional power. He couldn't win a committee vote. He was never going to be able to end a war by asking. What he had was the ability to show 16 million people an image of themselves that the people running their country had spent a decade insisting was impossible. A North and a South and a Center and a West in the same shirt, wanting the same thing at the same moment, and that image outlived all of it. February 2024, Ivory Coast hosted the Africa Cup of Nations, and after a group stage so bad they sacked their coach mid-tournament, they won it, in Abidjan, in front of their own people, beating Nigeria in the final. 2 years later, they were at the World Cup in North America, out in the round of 32 to Norway, Amad Diallo equalizing before Erling Haaland ended it with 4 minutes left. Ordinary football heartbreak in a country where football stopped being ordinary for a decade. No government in Ivory Coast's history managed to make that country agree on what it was. 3 presidents tried, and one of them ended up in The Hague for it. A striker in a soaked orange shirt, on his knees on a concrete floor 2,000 miles from home, couldn't sign a treaty or command an army or win a federation election. He just showed them the answer, standing in a line singing the anthem, and they never quite managed to unsee it.